During an uncertain time, we have a bit of a roadmap on the week ahead and what to expect. Plus, I want to talk to you about a foreign policy story that I think is really important to have on your radar that's not getting a lot of attention right now for understandable reasons, but I think is something that we can open our conversation to as we start off a new week. By the way, only the second Monday in 2021. Think about that. So let's talk about what's going to happen in Congress this week, and then we'll shift to foreign policy. So we'll start domestically and then we'll turn international. So we have some insight into exactly how Congress is going to play out this week. We have a lot of conversation about what's going to happen next with lawmakers, how they're going to challenge President Trump and his remaining days in office. And we have a little bit of an understanding from Democrats about what the game plan is. So first thing you should know is that all lawmakers right now are not in Washington, D.C. Some are at home in their districts. So there's not actively a ton of work being done in Washington, D.C. at this time, although we expect that to change. So tomorrow night, we expect to vote on a resolution regarding the 25th Amendment. Remember, the 25th Amendment is something that's never been used before. It came about in the 1960s after the assassination of JFK, as lawmakers were entertaining different scenarios of what should happen if a president wasn't able to fulfill their task. And so what the vote is in Congress would be for a resolution of support for the 25th Amendment, for the vice president and members of the cabinet to use the 25th Amendment essentially to remove President Trump from office in his remaining days. This resolution needs unanimous consent. It's likely it will not have unanimous consent. And so on Wednesday morning is when the House is expected to consider articles of impeachment. And that appears to be gaining some speed going into the middle of the week. Many of you have asked the question about why. Why is the House considering this? We know that there's so little time and President Trump's presidency. Even those of you who support this effort wonder about the timing. And so I was doing a little bit of reminding of myself about what the House is for and what the Senate is for, right? When the founders put these two bodies together, they wanted the House of Representatives to be more a reflection of the current feelings of the people. These representatives were going to be elected quickly every 2 years, and if there was a trend, a representative might catch part of that trend. But the Senate was supposed to be a more stable force where representatives were there for a 6-year period in order to ward off against trendiness, if you will. So the primary responsibility, according to James Madison, for the Senate was to protect the people against the presidency or against those that are in power, but also to protect against the whims, if you will, of the public. So remember, the goal of the House of Representatives when it comes to impeachment is to issue an official rebuke of a president. But the House of Representatives knows that it's not within their power to remove a president because that's for the Senate. And so this is an exercise in some ways of politics. Of course, politics are always at play, but lawmakers have stated very clearly that they want to be on the record. Some want the president to be removed from office and to see a vote in the Senate quickly, but some have stated that this is something that they want to be on the record for as a formal rebuke of this president, as a statement. And so this is what we're going to be watching. But remember, the House of Representatives is for this. This is their role in impeachment, where the Senate has a much different role. So just want to make you aware of that. So that only gets us to midweek. But I feel like that's about as far ahead as we can look, about 48 hours. I've checked repeatedly on the White House Twitter account, which is still active. I checked the press secretary as well, checked my email to see if we're getting anything from the White House, because we haven't in recent hours. And so far, I don't see anything noteworthy for you. We did see something from the State Department. So I'm going to shift to that rather quickly here, just to kind of give you a sampling of a couple things just to be aware of. I don't want to leave what's happening in the Capitol too soon. A couple things you should know about regarding what happened last week in the riot at Capitol Hill. We're continuing to see arrests added. We're continuing to see reports of extra security, not only in Washington, D.C., but also at state houses around the country as we move closer to Inauguration Day, which again is not this Wednesday, but the Wednesday after. So there's going to be a lot to handle there. We'll get to that as it comes up, but this is the game plan for Congress as it's mapped out. So let's talk a little bit about foreign policy. One story I've been really wanting to put on your radar is what's going on with Iran. And I want to do this for a couple different reasons. Iran is a major geopolitical player in the Middle East. and also a designated state sponsor of terror since 1984. What does that mean when the U.S. government does that? Well, designating a country as a state sponsor of terror, by the way, it's only with 3 countries right now, and that is Sudan, North Korea, and Iran. It enables the United States to use sanctions to I don't know what the correct word is, I guess counter efforts by a country to either be a terror actor or sponsor those that are producing terror around the world. And so Iran went on this list, if you will, in 1984. It has remained on that list through Republican and Democrat administrations. We don't often talk about where Republicans and Democrats actually share some commonalities, regardless of administrations. In the last several decades, Iran has stayed on this list. A major concern, of course, has been whether or not Iran, as a state sponsor of terror, could ever have access to a nuclear weapon. If that is the case, that will change the entire dynamic in the Middle East and, quite frankly, around the entire world. So this is why we really have to pay attention to what's happening in Iran. And over the last several weeks, there's been a few different stories that we've watched. So if you go back to before Christmas, there was a rocket attack at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. The U.S. thought it was Iranian-backed militias. We had a major aircraft carrier in the Middle East that was going to come home after a 10-month deployment. And the Department of Defense, right at the beginning of the year, said no. They announced that aircraft carrier was coming home from the Middle East and then said, no, actually they're staying. And they're staying because of Iranian behavior. There was some concern last year at this time. The United States targeted a powerful Iranian general, targeted and killed. You remember General Soleimani. And because we were marking a year since that event, there's been some concern about Iran also targeting American interests or Americans abroad. And so that's one of the reasons for the aircraft carrier staying in the Middle East. Since that time, Iran, over the last week, again, while we're really focused here at home, has seized an oil tanker and the crew of an oil tanker, South Korean oil tanker, as well as announced that they are moving closer towards the ability to produce a nuclear weapon. So this is all taking place, right? This is all what's going on right now regarding the Middle East. And the Associated Press actually came out with an interesting analysis saying this is going to be one of the biggest challenges for the new administration coming in, the quote-unquote Iran problem. The question over the next several weeks, as we're seeing a transition of power here in the United States and a lot of distraction domestically, is about whether or not our adversaries will try to take advantage of this chaos. We're already seeing Iran talk about what's happening in the United States to their benefit, saying that, look, world, this is what we've been dealing with these sanctions and with these Americans, trying to really use this to their benefit. And because we obviously have American personnel in the area, in the Middle East, and we've seen Iran target American assets abroad. Remember, Iran is responsible for the death of 2 Americans in a rocket attack last spring. So we forget these things, but this is all evolving. Can we go back and say who started it first? Well, we have to go back several decades. But this is where we sit right now at this very moment. And to take the conversation full circle, this is some of the concerns from Democrats, which is saying look at what's happening abroad. Do we trust the President of the United States right now to make responsible decisions if something were to happen that could lead us to an actual conflict? How quickly the news can change. So this is part of what Democrats are talking about with impeachment or use of the 25th Amendment. Of course, you have Republicans and others who believe that the president's policies in the Middle East have actually made us safer. That's a debate for another time, but I just want you to be aware of what's happening. Because when I look at the stories that are out there that can potentially impact our lives in real ways, as we look out to the horizon over the next several years, this is one of them. It also gives me an excuse to talk to you about something else. President Trump in the last several weeks talked about pulling back troops from Afghanistan and Iraq. And it's something I'm going to check into because this is something that's supposed to be taking place over the next 10 days. And again, that can be viewed as our adversaries as more of a retreat, right? Even though maybe that's not the way it's being presented to us. So these are a couple of things I want to, again, have you on your radar because whoever's in power, these are going to be stories that we're going to be talking about. So just wanted to make you aware of that. We have a lot of really, really big stories at this very intersection, don't we? And I know it's a lot, and there's a lot of voices and there's a lot of noise. And so we just want to kind of put down these little facts, keep you ahead of what's going on. And then when you see a headline, you have a little bit more preparation to meet that moment. And that's my hope for all of us, really. And you're very helpful in keeping me on track on that as well. Today marks an interesting day. Just kind of gives us some perspective. Amelia Earhart, my son is obsessed with her, by the way. We saw, if you just have a moment, National Geographic had this amazing piece on her, and we sat and watched it about 1.5 years ago, and he thinks she's really cool, which I think is cool too. But on this day, in 1935, she took off from Honolulu and flew to the west coast of the United States. This was a really big deal because she wasn't the first woman to do this. She was the first person to do this. And just think about that. That was 1935. That wasn't even 100 years ago. And think of all that we've been through as a nation since that time. 2 years later is when she went on her fateful flight. So I like these little pieces of history mixed in with our news because it gives us a little foundation of understanding. Sometimes the world seems to be moving very fast, and in a lot of ways it is, isn't it? Do you have any questions that maybe I could help with you right now? Just as we're kind of wrapping up here on a Monday. Again, there's so many different stories out there. I know I'm only touching on a few of them, but I just wanted to give you these two things as you're kind of moving into your next week. So keep those questions coming, and listen, there's going to be a lot coming at us over the next several days. We're going to look at the transition into a new administration that's expected on January 20th at noon. And really everything that we're seeing up until that moment is what we're working towards, right? That's our short-term horizon. Well, we have longer term horizons as well. By the way, just a note, I mentioned that the House of Representatives, lawmakers are not necessarily there to work. It's not that they're not working. They're just not necessarily, don't you have an image of them all in that chamber all the time? They're not really there all the time. The Senate, by the way, we don't really know what their schedule would be. So even if the House of Representatives, you see later this week, passes articles of impeachment, we actually don't even know when conceivably the Senate would be able to take that up. So time is a factor in all of these stories, right? In all of our lives. All right, guys, thank you so much for your support of Smarter News. More on our website, as always, at smarternews.com. You can spell it with an H, so SMARTHER news, or you could just be Smarter News. It's going to get you to the same place. It's awesome. Thank you, and I'll see you later on smarternews.com. Bye, guys.